Morgan Robertson wrote a novel about the largest ship ever built that struck an iceberg and sank on its maiden voyage from England to New York City. The ship's name was the Titan, and there wasn't enough lifeboats on board, and so majority of the people that were on the ship died. Does that sound familiar to you? The creepy thing is that Morgan Robertson's book was written 14 years prior to the real-life sinking of the RMS Titanic. I have been a huge Titanic buff since 1997 when I saw the movie by James Cameron in theaters for the first time. I actually ended up seeing it about 4 times in theaters between 1997 and 1998. But anyway, so today I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of Titanic and the legacy it leaves behind. Construction began in 1909. It was built in Belfast, Ireland by a company named Harland and Wolff. It was designed by a man named Thomas Andrews who worked for the Harland and Wolff shipping yard. And it was owned by the White Star Line, which was a British shipping company. At the time that it was built, it was the largest moving man-made object ever built. It also had a sister ship named the Olympic that was almost exactly the same size and almost an exact replica. In fact, most of the pictures that you see now of the Grand Staircase are from the Olympic as opposed to the Titanic, because there was never any actual pictures taken of the one on the Titanic, and it now doesn't exist. The Titanic was 882 feet long and 175 feet tall. It had 16 watertight compartments, and those compartments were what made the Titanic receive its name, that it was unsinkable, because even with up to 4 of those compartments filled with water, the ship would stay afloat. It set sail from Southampton, England on April 10th, 1912, scheduled to arrive in New York City on April 17th in 1912. It made a few stops along the way, with passengers getting off and on in France, and I believe there was another stop somewhere in Europe. It was captained by Edward James Smith, who went by EJ, and he worked for the White Star Line. He was a very notable captain for them. He was also a member of the British Navy. On the day that Titanic was leaving port and setting sail, it actually was delayed by an hour because it almost hit a much smaller ship named the SS New York. When Titanic set sail, it was carrying about 2,200 people, a little over 2,200 people, and they paid anywhere from $35 to $400 for a ticket. Speaking of the Grand Staircase, it was the most notable feature by far on the ship. Anybody that's seen the movie knows that it's basically the epicenter of the ship itself, mainly for first-class passengers. It was made with English oak, and it had a beautiful wrought iron and glass dome at the top of it. There were many recreational features on the ship, including a gym, Turkish baths, saunas, stuff like that. There was also a swimming pool, but it was reserved for first class only. And they also had to pay 1 shilling to use it. Food was considered top-notch on the Titanic. Even if you were in third-class steerage, you still got pretty good food compared to other passenger liners that were around at the time. And something very interesting is that the third-class passengers had 2 bathtubs, one for men and one for women, and there was over 700 passengers in third class. So I can't imagine sharing a tub with, one other person like that. It's a little much. So on the day Titanic sank, or I should say, I guess the day Titanic struck the iceberg, it was April 14th, 1912. They received 6 iceberg warnings throughout the day from other ships that were in the area. They were traveling through what is known as Iceberg Alley off of the coast of Newfoundland. There were only 20 lifeboats on board, which was enough for maybe half of the passengers. So if it was to sink, only half of the passengers would live. The iceberg struck the starboard side at about 11:40 p.m. and it took about 2 hours and 40 minutes for the ship to completely sink. When it started to sink, the bow was filling up first, and once it got too full and once it was almost completely halfway submerged underwater, the ship broke in half. The stern went up and then slowly went down. I say slowly, but really it actually went pretty fast for how heavy piece of equipment that was. Only 706 people survived the sinking. That's the rough estimate. That's what most historians have come up with. They were rescued by the SS Carpathia, who didn't arrive until 4 a.m., which was about an hour or so, I guess, after the after the boat actually sank. The SS Carpathia was notified with an SOS from the Titanic, and it took them 4 hours to get to the ship. So there was a lot of new laws that came about after the Titanic sank. One of them being that there had to be enough lifeboats on board for every single passenger that the ship could accommodate, regardless if the ship was at full capacity or not. The Radio Act of 1912 was passed, which meant that every radio system on every ship had to be operating for 24 hours. There was no excuse. There was a ship that arrived a little bit later, the SS California, that was much closer than the SS Carpathia, and because they turned off their wireless communication, they did not receive the SOS, and so had they had that on all night, they may have received that, and a lot more people could have been saved. Titanic was discovered in 1985 by 2 men who were desperate to find it. Nobody knew where it was laying, and it was hard at that time, until that time, I guess, to get equipment that was able to travel as far down as the Titanic was. It's about 12,600 feet on the ocean, below the ocean surface. So there was a few notable victims of the Titanic. The most notable would probably be the captain, Edward Smith. Also, John Jacob Astor, he was the richest man on the ship. And Isidore and Ida Strauss, Isidore was a co-owner of Macy's department store at the time. They're depicted in the movie as the couple that's cuddling as the ship is sinking. That didn't happen in real life. They were actually swept away by a wave that came over while they were about to get off, after they got off a lifeboat, because they wanted to be together. Thomas Andrews, the ship's architect, also went down with the ship. Benjamin Guggenheim of the Guggenheim family, who at the time was one of the richest families in the world, and then as well as Officer Murdoch, who was the first officer. He was in charge of the ship at the time when the iceberg struck. There were a few survivors who were also very famous. Margaret Brown, she's probably the most famous of all the survivors. We know her now in history as the unsinkable Molly Brown. She was honored for her heroism because she was able to keep everybody on Lifeboat 6 calm, and she actually began rowing the boat to try to find victims in the water to save. J. Bruce Ismay, who was the owner, or I guess chairman, of White Star Line, he was actually shunned for the most part after the Titanic incident, simply because he was deemed a coward for getting into a lifeboat and not going down with the ship as well. There was a women and children only, or women and children first, I guess, rule, which is still a rule to this day. And then you have the Lady Duff and Sir Cosmo Gordon Duff. They were, she was a fashion designer. He was a wealthy businessman. The two of them were married, and they managed to escape. It's widely believed that Sir Cosmo bribed the officers that were in charge of his lifeboat, so that they wouldn't go back and rescue people, because he was fearful that they would capsize and be overcrowded. There were only 12 people counted on his lifeboat, however, that held 60 people. So, and then these are just some other photos. You can see up here you have a picture of the propellers when they were initially installed. Down here is a picture of what it looks like now on the bottom floor of the ocean floor. The picture at the top middle is the stern of the boat, which was the last piece to go down. And then the bottom below that is the bow of the boat, which was the first part to go down. And then up at the top you have the lifeboats on the ship and the davits that were used to hold them. Down below that picture is a actual davit that's below, that's rusting away. Experts say that the Titanic will probably be completely gone from the ocean floor by the year 2030. So it will fade into oblivion for the most part. It's been 108 years since the Titanic sank, and 2/3 of her passengers met their tragic end that night. The waters were 28 degrees, so your life expectancy, if you weren't in a boat, was very, very slim. I believe there were only about 6 people who were actually saved from the water that weren't in boats. We may never know the full story of what happened with the Titanic. However, history and film depictions and oceanic research has given us a pretty clear picture of it. The Titanic was the ship of dreams, but it ended in a tragic nightmare.